deal to end the war. The announcement is having a major impact on the markets and oil prices, which are now under $100 a barrel. But the question is, will Americans see relief at the gas pump anytime soon? Plus, J.D. Vance continues to campaign for an autocrat in Eastern Europe, delivering a stump speech that resembled something you would hear at a MAGA rally in a red state. We'll bring you the latest with a live report from Budapest. With us, we have the co-host of our 9 a.m. hour, staff writer at The Atlantic, Jonathan Lemire, columnist and associate editor of The Washington Post, David Ignatius is with us, managing editor at The Bulwark, Sam Stein, otherwise known as the Easter Bunny, opinion columnist for The New York Times, David French, and former White House official under President Biden, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby, who is an MS Now national security analyst. So a lot to get to this morning, Willie. Including how we're back to exactly kind of where we were with the Strait of Hormuz.
Yeah, that's right. After nearly 40 days of fighting now, the United States and Iran have agreed to a 2-week ceasefire. President Trump announced the agreement on social media last night, just about an hour before his self-imposed deadline for Iran to come to a deal or face the obliteration of its infrastructure and, in the president's words, its whole civilization. Trump said at the urging of Pakistani mediators he would withhold his threatened apocalyptic attacks on Iran for 2 weeks, subject to the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian officials accepted the ceasefire, with the foreign minister there saying passage through the strait would be possible via coordination with the Iranian military. The pause now buys both sides some time to try to reach a permanent end to the war. Israel, meanwhile, agreed to suspend strikes on Iran, but is insisting the ceasefire does not include Lebanon, issuing an evacuation order for a southern city there just this morning. Missile alerts also continue to sound in several Gulf states in the hours after the deal was reached. In a sign, ceasefire orders may not yet have filtered down to some Iranian forces. David Ignatius, let's start with you and pause here for just a moment. We all agree that a cessation of attacks on both sides for now is good for 2 weeks, but to what end? Are there real negotiations going on? And now, with Iran still effectively controlling the straits, but just letting ships through for a couple of weeks, does this look like progress to you?
So, Willie, without question, there is a sigh of relief, I think was felt around the world, that we've moved from this extraordinary threat to wipe out a civilization to a process of discussion that's said to begin Friday in Islamabad, and acceptance by both sides of basic terms. The problem, as always in negotiation, is the ambiguity of the two sides' positions. President Trump has said that the Iranian 10-point proposal for resolving this conflict, for a ceasefire, is a workable basis for negotiation. But when you look carefully at it, there are a number of items that the U.S. is going to have trouble with. And it's striking, 40 days into this conflict, the U.S. has gone from demanding unconditional surrender from Iran to basically working on the Iranian term sheet for a settlement. That's going to lead to a lot of bumps in the road ahead. Also, there's going to be so much discussion about whether Donald Trump's rhetorical style, his wild threats, ended up harming the U.S. position in global opinion. Pope Leo called it totally unacceptable in the last hours before Trump decided to accept negotiation. Or whether, I'm sure in Trump's mind, it was part of forcing Iran into finally accepting a negotiated structure. And then lastly, what exactly has happened in terms of reopening the Strait of Hormuz? That's the key issue in terms of the global economy. Iran is saying that it will work with Oman across the strait on a system to allow shipping in and out, but it also talks about the two of them collecting tolls, revenues. That's going to be something that will be very hard to negotiate. But the details now are to be worked out. This is the kind of negotiation that could easily collapse because of differences you can already see. But again, the financial markets are telling us there's generally a sense of enormous relief.
Yeah, Admiral Kirby, kind of an extraordinary headline in the Wall Street Journal this morning. Trump backs off threat to level Iran. That's where we were entering this negotiation and a 2-week ceasefire that he had said, quote, a whole civilization will die tonight, never to be brought back again, from the United States president. That drew criticism from some Republicans, not many. But your sense of where things are now and what these 2 weeks buy in terms of finding a permanent end to the war?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? I mean, the three things I'm watching, and David covered a little bit, was will the ceasefire hold? That's an open question, Willie, because there's not a great history here. The last time Israel and Iran earlier this year declared a ceasefire, they were still slugging it out because the command and control systems in Iran are not well established after 40 days of war here. And the IRGC operates kind of independently. So we got to see whether that holds. Number two is, as David said, we got to see what the Strait opening looks like. And it's important for folks to remember that before this war, the Strait was well open, and somewhere between 100 and 135 ships were transiting that strait every single day without molestation, without having to pay any tolls, without any checking in with the Iranian military. So the Strait, though it may be open, will be restricted, and that will affect the flow of oil. And then number three, of course, is where these talks go in Pakistan and Islamabad, and that's a very, very open question. What I'm concerned about, or what I'm looking for here, is when we get to peace talks, what will be the role of the IRGC and the regime going forward? Are we just leaving them in power? And with what capability will they be left with? Because although a lot of it has been degraded over 40 days, it has not been eliminated. Their ability to threaten their neighbors still exists. And so what's that going to look like at the end of these peace talks?
So President Trump says the 2-week ceasefire will give the United States and Iran time to finalize a peace agreement. But as David Ignatius and Admiral Kirby discussed, there are significant sticking points among Iran's 10-point proposal for peace. So that's the U.S. would guarantee a complete end to all strikes against Iran on a permanent basis. Frozen Iranian assets would be returned to the regime. Sanctions would be lifted. American combat forces would be withdrawn from the region. Israeli operations would cease in Lebanon and against other Iranian allies. Iran and Oman would collect fees from passing cargo ships to help rebuild, and the United Nations would pass a binding resolution affirming those details. Still, a significant unanswered question revolves around the status of Iran's nuclear program, and those details are not clear. What do you make of this plan and how acceptable it might be?
Well, there are some real sticking points. Also, in the Farsi version of this, in the language in Iran, there is mention of keeping some uranium enrichment capabilities, which President Trump has said is a no-go. So there's clearly work to do this weekend. And there's also, of course, the fact of the matter, the Strait of Hormuz, as just mentioned, was prior to this conflict open, and ships used it. And what is at the without a toll,
without overseers,
right? And without this outcome, at least for now, Iran has increased their control over the Strait of Hormuz and has now learned that if they can turn that spigot on and off, that gives them an extraordinary amount of leverage over the world's energy supply and, of course, the United States. So that is, these are significant obstacles that still need to be cleared, even as the ceasefire now starts. And David French, let's talk a little bit about how we got here. The president's posting yesterday morning, we dealt with it in real time on air, should not be glossed over here. The language there was, a war crime. It threatens war crime. It threatened genocidal-like behavior. It is the kind of language, as I said yesterday, associated with the monsters of history, to wipe out a civilization. That's simply not how presidents speak. That's not how leaders of democracies speak. Now, Trump aides say, well, that was part of the plan, the art of the deal. There was that kind of bellicose language that got Iran to the table. Perhaps that's true, perhaps not. But not only are we not sure what that deal looks like, I think we also need to grapple with what happened yesterday is something that will leave a stain on the White House, the legacy of this president, but also how the U.S. is viewed throughout the world, and particularly in that region and in Iran, where certainly a vengeful regime someday could still lash out.
Yeah, I'm going to use a phrase that was popularized after World War I to distinguish the tactical brilliance and courage of service members from the absolute failure of strategic leadership by the political leadership. And that phrase, and a lot of folks who are listening or watching will be familiar with it, is lions led by donkeys. And what that means is you have a military here, a United States military that is tactically brilliant, that has accomplished remarkable things in its missions. Particularly, we saw this incredible rescue over Easter weekend of a downed pilot deep in Iran. Just a remarkable accomplishment by the military. But all of that tactical brilliance has been in service of a man who's unstable, who's unhinged, who had no real strategic vision, obviously, given all of the different contradictory war aims he's announced and war objectives that he said have been achieved or not achieved. And then it culminates in this, what is truly a horrible episode. And I don't want to hear a single person say, oh, don't pay attention to this. This is just a negotiating tactic. The man wasn't just threatening war crimes. The man was threatening actions that have constituted the basis of allegations that Russia has committed crimes against humanity in the nation of Ukraine. He is promising an infrastructure campaign, arguably even more comprehensive and more deadly than what Vladimir Putin has tried against Ukraine. This is a stain on the United States of America. It's an absolute stain. And then to end it with this 2-week ceasefire, which the world is rightfully breathing a sigh of relief, but it never should have been in this position to begin with. And the terms of that ceasefire seem to be completely up in the air. Monitoring it overnight, you could see there was no consensus about what the terms were, how this was going to be worked out. And everyone's right. As of right now, Iran is left with greater control over the Strait of Hormuz than it had before, with potential to receive even greater financial rewards that could be used to reconstitute all of the equipment that it has lost. So right now, the American people should be demanding answers through Congress from this president. How do we reach a point where an American president in charge of the American military seems to be on the verge of ordering them to commit some of those clearly obvious war crimes in modern history? That's what we were facing. And we should not sugarcoat any element of this, because at the very last moment, the order was not given, that this unbelievably unlawful order was not given. And now we're left in a state of total strategic ambiguity, where Iran, weirdly enough, could come out of this in a stronger geostrategic position in spite of all of the damage done to its military than it had before. This is a stunning development.
Sam Stein.
Well, I mean, I would just further that, right? This was not a cost-free 4 weeks. We spent hundreds of billions of dollars. Our munitions stockpiles depleted. There are 13 service members who have died. There are thousands of Iranians who have died. A elementary school was bombed in Iran. Infrastructure, critical energy infrastructure in a number of states was damaged or completely ruined. That has to now be reconstituted. And then, as David mentions, all the other stuff. Reopening the strait, it's not going to happen. Now we have to apparently have a surcharge on ships. So I go about the stuff, and I know people like to pile on Trump in these moments and say, well, he tacoed, and he was always going to taco. And I just think that's just the wrong framework, because it's not about chickening out. This brinksmanship, and I guess I should ask David about this, this brinksmanship has real, tangible costs, real costs, a substantial cost, not just over the past 4 weeks, but going forward. I mean, how do any Gulf state allies, how do they rearrange their geopolitical thinking around this? How are the Europeans ever going to trust us again when we said to them, you have to go reopen the strait? I mean, how does this reorient the global world in a matter of just 4 weeks?
So I think this does add to new questions about American leadership. I think European and Asian countries will come away relieved at what we hope will be some kind of patched together settlement, but less confident that America has a clear strategic direction. It will mean that the Arab Gulf countries, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Bahrain, will be under what will be more or less permanent potential threat in coming years from Iran. Contrary to the President Trump's claims that there's been a kind of regime change because there's a new cast of characters in Tehran, I look at this as regime reinforcement.
Right.
I mean, Iran has taken America's and Israel's best punch and is still standing, is still negotiating. You know, the talk of unconditional surrender has been replaced.
They are mocking us right now, yeah.
And I just make one final point that many of the initial analyses kind of bumped over. President Trump affirmed that China played an important role with Pakistan, its close ally, in framing the terms of what appears to be the initial settlement proposal. That's a big diplomatic step forward for China. And we'll see in coming weeks whether China is going to be, in effect, a co-guarantor of the settlement. That would be a different world where a major conflict has a key Chinese role in settling it.
So, Admiral Kirby, Iran, they're not gleeful at the moment, but they do, as David and others have been saying, do feel like they've taken the United States' punch over the last 40 days and still standing in many ways. So what is, if you think about this 2-week ceasefire, the president says hopefully within these 2 weeks they come to a permanent end to the war and that he will not have to end the civilization, as he put it. What is the best possible outcome now under the current state of play for the United States? How do you see this playing out in the best way for the U.S.? How does this end well?
Well, I mean, the best way that it would end, in my mind, is that you don't leave the regime in power here, and that you have some sort of guarantees about how and in what way they will be able to exert military power in the region, and to what degree they can be limited in terms of the threats that they pose. But honestly, Willie, I'm pessimistic about us getting to that kind of point. What appears to be the case going forward here is that the regime will stay in power. And as everybody has said, it's not a less radical regime than the one before. It's different, but it's still a theocratic, aggressive regime. And I worry that they're going to be left in power. And what does that mean? And this is something that's been bugging me now for a few days, is what does all this mean for the Iranian people? I never heard the president once mention the Iranian people in his speech in the White House last week, and I've heard little about what the future looks like for them in the last 48 hours. So when we get to a peace deal, if we get to a peace deal, I'm going to be looking for post-conflict governance and how the needs of the Iranian people are going to be met. Some 3 million of them are displaced in the country right now, infrastructure, buildings ruined. What does reconstruction look like? So the best possible scenario for me would be a stable regime that is responsible and is responsive to the needs of the Iranian people going forward. And I'm afraid I'm not seeing signs of that right now.
And Mika, on the question of regime change, there's an extraordinary piece we're going to dig into on the front page of the New York Times from Maggie Haberman and Jonathan Swan about how Trump took the U.S. to war. And in some of these meetings, you had the CIA director telling the President of the United States the idea of regime change was, quote, farcical, with Secretary of State Rubio stepping in saying, what he's saying, Mr. President, is that idea is BS.
Wow. Okay. We'll get to that. MS Now national security analyst, retired Rear Admiral John Kirby, thank you so much for getting up early for us. Good to see you again. And still ahead on Morning Joe, we'll have much more on Iran, including that new reporting Willie just mentioned on what went on behind the scenes within the White House ahead of J.D. Vance is still in Hungary this morning ahead of this weekend's high-stakes elections there. Vance has been campaigning for Prime Minister Viktor Orbán on the ground in Budapest, even dialing up President Trump yesterday, who joined in on the praise for the authoritarian leader.
Well, I just want to tell you, I'm a big fan of Viktor. I'm with him all the way. The United States is with him all the way. And it's a real honor to talk to you. You're really incredible people with great enthusiasm and brilliance, because you're brilliant people. And I really love it. You have a man that kept your country strong, and he kept your country good. And you don't have problems with all of the problems that so many other countries have because they let their countries be invaded.
Will you stand against the bureaucrats in Brussels? Will you stand for sovereignty and democracy? Will you stand for Western civilization? Will you stand for Will you stand for freedom, for truth, and for the God of our fathers? Then, my friends, go to the polls in the weekend, stand with Viktor Orbán because he stands for you and he stands for all these things. God bless Hungary and God bless the United States of America. Thank you.
All right, before we go to our reporter on the ground, David French, at times like this, I like to take a look at what Trump-adjacent networks are saying. Like, how do they talk about being on the brink of decimated a civilization and Vance doing what he was doing? And I noticed one broadcast that danced around the Iran issue with word salad and then quickly mentioned perhaps we want to get to this situation with Vance because it's troubling, but then proceeded to do the rest of their show about Gavin Newsom's woke wife and how you have to show ID at the Obama Center. So avoidance was the way they got around moments like this. But moments like this can't be ignored. Tell us your thoughts about what we just saw.
Yeah, what we saw was extraordinary. And if you're wondering why would a vice president of the United States and a president of the United States try to intervene in an election of one of the least powerful countries in Europe, Hungary. This is not a European power by any means. You have to understand the outsized role that Viktor Orbán has in the imagination of part of the American right. That he's not, in their view, some small-time wannabe autocrat of a small European country. No, to them, he is the vanguard of a sweeping global change in the very identity of Western leadership. And if he is ousted from office, a lot of the whole proof of concept of the entire sort of international right-wing revolution just starts to falter. In much the same way, the whole vibe shift that existed after the November 2024 election, when a lot of MAGA thought that they were on the cusp of large-scale permanent change in the United States of America, is evaporating before our eyes in the U.S. as the Democrats just consistently overperform in election after election. What's happening in Hungary is very much connected to how parts of MAGA, especially sort of the intellectual post-liberal right in MAGA, sees itself and sees its hopes for the future. And so if Viktor Orbán is a here today, gone tomorrow, small-time European politician, well, then he's of no consequence. But if he can keep winning and arguably translate that into wider gains for sort of the populist reactionary right around the world, then he's on the cusp of something. He's on the wave of beginning of the wave of something. But it's becoming very clear right now that the populist energy is dissipating, that the Trump movement has squandered all of the momentum it had after the November elections, and that it's bringing us chaos far more than any sort of revolutionary new Western order.
All right, joining us live from Budapest, Hungary, MS Now international reporter Ines de la Quatera. Ines, what's the reaction in the region to Vice President Vance's visit and President Trump's praise?
Yeah, so it depends who you talk to. If you talk to Peter Magyar, Orbán's big opponent in this election, he has been clear that he feels Vance campaigning for Orbán is a form of foreign election interference. Ironically, Vance says that it's the European Union that's been meddling in Hungarian affairs by withholding funding from Hungary because they don't agree with some of Orbán's policies. But yeah, a full-throated endorsement of Viktor Orbán by the U.S. vice president. And you heard it there. It wasn't just him. It was also President Trump calling into that rally, talking about how he loves Orbán, how Orbán has done great things for Hungary. Orbán, of course, a very controversial figure, someone who's been repeatedly at odds with the European Union over things like corruption, like Russia, like Ukraine. He's actually maintained a very close relationship with the Russian President Vladimir Putin throughout the war in Ukraine. He's also blocked financial aid to Ukraine, and he is Europe's longest-serving leader. He's been in power for 16 years, pretty much unchallenged, but that is changing now with Peter Magyar really emerging as stern competition for Orbán. Now, we'll see if Orbán manages to close the gap. A lot of polls do show Magyar leading in a lot of those polls, but Orbán has been trying to close the gap by campaigning, for example, with Vance. It's unclear whether that will really help him, though. We should point out that part of the reason that Magyar has been leading is because of domestic political issues. So things like corruption, like the economy, the fact that Hungary has the the third lowest wages in the European Union. We did talk to a political analyst here about all of this and whether Vance could actually help Orbán. I'll let you listen to what she had to say.
Viktor Orbán built up his narrative as a global leader. So obviously, Vance's visit is a big shot for him. On the other hand, the opposition and a lot of disappointed Hungarians are really fed up with Orbán as such, with all his global glory, because of the governance is really not working in Hungary any longer. So there's a very strong kind of local focus of the campaign of the opposition. So we don't really know whether this actually matters so much.
And so there is a sense that if Orbán does lose this election, it could signify, the beginning of the end of the rise of populism in Europe. And I think the fact that you're seeing Vance here taking time out of his busy schedule, even as they're trying to figure everything out with Iran, goes to show that MAGA world really cares about what this might mean for Hungary, for Europe, but also for themselves, for the MAGA movement, and for populism more broadly.
MS Now international reporter Inez de la Quatera reporting live from Budapest, Hungary this morning. Inez, thanks so much. Let's bring in editor at The Insider, Michael Weiss, for more on the election, as well as his new reporting about Hungary's foreign minister and his ties to Russia. Michael, always great to see you. You've been listening to this reporting coming out of Hungary. I'm curious, one of the things that stood out to a lot of people yesterday was at that rally was Vice President Vance heralding Orbán as this great statesman who's trying to broker an end to the war between Russia and Ukraine, when in fact he's doing exactly the opposite. He's standing in the way of many of the things that would bring an end to the war. So can you just kind of take a step back, because this is sort of your beat, and explain Hungary's role in that war, its close ties to Putin, and what it means to have the American vice president there rallying on his behalf?
Well, so Hungary, at the very start of this, is wholly reliant on Russian gas and energy, to keep the lights on. So Hungary basically is paying Russia to facilitate its own war machinery in Ukraine. From the very start, Hungary has said this war was unnecessary. It's really the fault of the West and the United States and the European Union. We don't support Ukraine. We have to do a deal with the Kremlin. His entire campaign this election, I mean, again, Hungary is an economic ruin. You said, the third smallest level of wages in all of Europe and the rest of it. The entire campaign platform has been Ukraine is this bugbear, right? They are the ones that are trying to bring chaos and subversion to Hungary. If you vote for the opposition, Peter Magyar, it's going to lead to World War III. However, the reporting that we have, and we have receipts, we have intercepts between Viktor Orbán's foreign minister, Peter Szijjártó, and the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov. These intercepts show really a conspiracy. One European intelligence official that we queried said, listening to the two of them talk, it's like Lavrov is a case officer handling an agent in the field. What do they show? The latest disclosures that we have, which is going to go up online at V-Square in about half an hour, show that when the European Union was negotiating Ukraine's accession talks, Ukraine wants to join the EU very forcefully. Also, the accession talks for Moldova, another impoverished nation in Europe. Szijjártó would step out of the meeting, call Lavrov, and give him a play-by-play of how Hungary was threatening to block, financial aid to Ukraine, doing everything it could to stop that accession. There's a direct quote that Lavrov tells, again, to the Hungarian foreign minister. He says, Peter, sometimes goodwill direct blackmailing is the best option. Now, this is one of several phone calls of this nature. They also discussed the famous Alaska summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. In this instance, it was Szijjártó querying Lavrov for information about how badly did this go, because in Europe, there's high dudgeon about the Russians basically eating the Americans' lunch and selling Ukraine down the river. Lavrov was reassuring him that things are going well. I mean, again, it is a weird conspiracy, because Hungary is not only a member of the European Union, it is also a member of NATO. And one of the things that they volunteered themselves to do was to block any aid packages, any sanctions against Russia for the war in Ukraine, using the same rhetoric, the same narratives that the Kremlin has used from the beginning, the root causes of the war, right?
Certainly the conflict between Russia and Ukraine shadows this election. Orbán's trying to paint Zelensky as sort of a villain in this somehow. We heard even Vance, the Vice President of the United States, suggested it was Ukraine trying to interfere with the election there. When we know, of course, Russia has a long history of interference with elections. What do we know about what they're trying to do now to prop up Orbán in these last days of the campaign? And what are your concerns if the polls are right and Orbán loses?
Yeah.
What happens next?
So it's kind of extraordinary. You have the Vice President of the United States in Budapest. You know who else is in Budapest, according to our reporting? GRU officers, Russian military intelligence operatives, so-called political technologists, which is a Russian term of art for people who fix elections and sow disinformation and push social media-borne narratives. Sounds familiar. These are the guys that did the same thing in 2016 in our election. So you have the Vice President of the United States singing from the same hymn sheet as Russian military intelligence, the same organization that goes around the world poisoning dissidents, blowing up ammunition depots, interfering in other sovereign democracies, including our own, and using the same exact narrative, right? Ukraine is the enemy. Ukrainian intelligence is responsible for trying to sway this election, not the Russians and not even, the United States. My fear, the fear of our colleagues at V Square, including, by the way, one of my colleagues, who the Hungarians have opened an investigation into because of this reporting, alleging that he is a foreign spy, he is on the Ukrainian payroll, is that Orbán loses, and loses dramatically, but doesn't leave, doesn't want to go quietly, and then what happens? A revolution in the streets, the Hungarians are not going to take this lying down. And if this turns bloody, if this turns violent, if the Russians intercede in some manner, where does that leave Hungary? Again, a member of NATO and a member of the European Union. They could have their rights at the EU suspended permanently for trying to steal an election like this.
I wonder where Republicans are in this. I mean, this is so Trumpian, way out in the open.
Way out in the open.
And it's going to require people to recognize what is happening. A lot of people want to just get through the week, and do their jobs and figure out how to pay for gas. Sam Stein.
Yeah, look, I couldn't ignore the dichotomy here of J.D. Vance across the globe doing campaigning for a foreign autocrat. As we have, I mean, there's not like an absence of domestic elections happening. We had elections last night in Marjorie Taylor Greene's old district. He is not working domestic politics right now. He's out overseas, which gives you a sense of how the Trump administration views the importance of this election. I do share Michael's concerns about what happens if the polls do project correctly and there is an outcome that Orbán and the Russians don't like. But I guess, and David, this is for you as well, it does sort of raise questions about the status of the U.S.-Russian relationship, right? So we had reporting over the past couple of weeks the Russians were supplying the Iranians with satellite imagery. Obviously, they have close ties to the Iranians, and also that we had allowed Russian oil into Cuba, even though we had been fairly bellicose with how we were going to blockade the island and get regime change there. And then in the backdrop, of course, is the Ukraine situation, where Ukraine was helping us with anti-drone technology, and yet I still can't get over the possibility and the fact, frankly, that the Trump administration's posture to Iran is more friendly than we could possibly imagine, considering all this.
So as the Iran war perhaps begins to wind down, attention's going to return to the Ukraine war. Ukraine has been remarkably successful in blunting the Russian offensive. Last winter, spring is coming. The Russians may have new efforts to take the rest of the Donetsk province that they've coveted. On the verge of this, to have the American vice president campaigning for Russia's most important ally in Europe, who stands against so many of the policies of the European Union, which includes France, Germany, the countries that are the key traditional allies for the United States for 70 years, is amazing to see him, kind of calling on all the political gods to bring down bring down the person closest to the rest of Europe. Again, it's one of those things you never thought you'd see, but you're seeing it every day. The next issue, I think, for all of us to focus on is can the Ukrainians really hold on against what will be growing Russian pressure, whether Orbán wins or loses?
Miko, one last note on this. The Wall Street Journal editorial page this morning deeply critical of J.D. Vance's visit to Hungary and suggesting that this is a lot about 2028 for him, that if he's going to run for president, he's trying to signal that he's with Donald Trump and that he's with sort of this MAGA podcast universe that supports Viktor Orbán and others like him.
Again, on everything, I asked the question Joe was asking yesterday, where are the Republicans? Where are they? Who are they? at this point. I don't get it. David Ignatius, David French, and Sam Stein, thank you all very much for being on the show this morning. Editor at The Insider, Michael Weiss, thank you as well for your reporting and analysis this morning. Good to see you. And coming up, it's the first day of the annual National Action Network Convention.